Hi, this is Larry Bauer, Chief Executive Officer of the Family Medicine Education Consortium, and I'm talking today with Dr. Bob Graham, former Executive Vice President of the American Academy of Family Physicians. He was in that role from, if I have this correct, Bob, from 1985 to 2000?
That's correct.
And our conversation is going to focus on what some people might call the good old days, back when family medicine was very nascent and growing, and that would be the period from about 1973 on. So the first family medicine residency programs, the first 15, to my understanding, were approved in 1968. Does that sound about right, Bob?
You may be absolutely right, or you're just a year off. In my memory, they began operating in 1969, so the difference there might be when they were approved and when they actually started operating.
Okay. And can you take us back to that period of time? What was it like to be in family practice at the time? It had just a short time before moved from general practice into family practice, but from your perspective now, looking back, what was it like back then?
Well, in my role in 1973 with the Academy, I was just 3 years out of medical school. So I graduated from medical school in 1970, went immediately into the U.S. Public Health Service as part of the draft obligation during the Vietnam era, and wound up working on the immediate staff of Vern Wilson, Dr. Vernon Wilson, who was the head of a very large federal agency at that point called the Health Services and Mental Health Administration. And I did not have any particular insider background about the new specialty of family medicine at that point, and actually the projects that I worked on for Dr. Wilson did not relate directly to that. But there were two fortuitous connections there. One, Vern was one of the founding board members of the American Board of Family Practice, now ABFM. And when he came to Washington in 1970 to take over responsibility of that agency, he came from the University of Missouri, and he brought with him Marion Bishop, who's a sociologist and clearly a name that many in family medicine now know and remember.
Yes.
And he brought Marion with him because he said this is a huge agency. Things are changing in Washington. It's you've got a background in sociology, so it'd be fascinating for you to look at it, look at the agency, look at what we do, think about it, write about it a little bit. So there you had Vern Wilson, who would call himself an old-time GP, never really was in the practice side of medicine, got involved in administration and public policy. I knew Marion, who was in the Department of Family Medicine at University of Missouri at that point. And then, for about 73 to 75, I'm there working with them, spending time with them. And Marion was the one who made the connection between me and the Academy. She knew that I was a native of Kansas City. I'd gone to the University of Kansas School of Medicine. She had connections with the Academy at that point and knew that they were looking for someone on their education staff to work with the developing residencies and departments of family medicine. So you talked about the first residencies being approved by the Residency Review Committee in 68 or 69. Probably by the time I joined the Academy in February of 1973, I'm going to say there were 70 or 75 residencies, and that I could be off by 25, sure, but I'm not off by 150. And I'm going to take a guess that there may be 20 or so academic departments of family medicine. So the curves were moving up, but they were just getting started. One of the significant things that happened in Washington during the early 70s, largely through the lobbying of the Academy of Family Physicians and one of their past presidents, Amos Johnson from eastern North Carolina, was the passage of the provision to provide financial support to departments of, to residencies for family medicine, and then later for departments of family medicine. So that, and I don't recall, those authorities were not in the agency where Vern Wilson was. The Bureau of Health Professions at that point was still part of NIH. But the availability of that money injected a lot of energy into the discipline, as you can understand. And so when I arrived in Kansas City, it was to be the assistant division director for the Division of Education. And a gentleman, a physician by the name of Tom Johnson, who's also somebody that Dr. Bishop knew very well, was the division director. And Tom had spent the last 3 or 4 years prior to my arrival getting in his car and driving literally all over the United States to provide consultation with hospitals that wanted to start residencies in family medicine. Tom was not comfortable flying, and so he did all of this driving. And, part of my task when I got there was to assist him in this. And so I started doing, flying was fine with me. I was still single at that point. And so it was just a matter of getting a boarding pass and going where somebody needed to have some consultation. The reason that Tom and I were reasonable consultants in doing this is we had the opportunity as Academy staff to sit in on residency review committee meetings, hear their discussion of applications, and have a very good sense of what the residency review committee was looking for in terms of a successful application. So, we didn't violate any confidence as we went out and did consultation. But we still online, Larry?
We're still here. Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I just suddenly I was hearing some other wording in the background.
Right.
And so after I was there for about 6 months, Tom decided to retire from the academy. And so for about 6 to 9 months, essentially all I did was go to various hospitals and increasingly medical schools in the United States and try to provide some outside third-party perspective on what was necessary for residencies to get accredited by the residency review committees, and then for the academic departments, which is a slightly different issue because there's no accreditation, but they still had to have a way to stake out some territory within schools of medicine who were not, in many cases, not terribly enthusiastic about having them. So that was a time, because of the direct support provided by the Academy and because of the availability of funds, where you saw a very rapid increase in the number of residencies in family medicine in the United States from 73 to 75 to 78. We used to have annual charts, and I can see the curves going up, but I don't remember what the exact numbers were. And then Tom Johnson was succeeded as the division director by Tom Stern. So Tom joined the academy, I think, in late 74, if I'm remembering correctly, He had been a residency director in Santa Monica, California, was very, very familiar with the Residency Review Committee and what it took to run a good, strong residency. And Tom, put in place a consultative, a much more organized and elaborate consultative mechanism to provide support to the continuing needs for development of the residencies and departments of family medicine. I left the academy in December of '75. Dan Ostergaard took my position, and he and Tom really built that mechanism out over the next 3 or 4 years. That is where the residency assistance program, RAP, came from.
Right.
Tom
right.
invented it.
Right. Bob, can I interrupt for just a second? I'd like to go back to a point that you made about the medical schools not being very enthusiastic. What was it that, number one, why weren't they enthusiastic? And number two, what was it that pushed them to change and to let family medicine in?
Well, every medical school is unique in its own way and has its own culture. But I think a very consistent culture within the medical schools, which are made up of their faculty members with the individual departments, is these are physicians who have dedicated their lives to one specialty or subspecialty. That is their focus. That is their passion. That's the way the world makes sense to them, is to know more and more about a very narrow field, and to be able to perform at a very high level in diagnosing and treating and curing individuals with a particular problem that falls within that narrow area. So then you get this concept of somebody wants to come into that educational environment and say, I'm going to train people to be broadly educated. I'm going to train them to know a lot about everything. And that's just a culture conflict. The faculty of the medical schools are saying, that not only am I not comfortable with it, I don't think that's the right way to train doctors. There has been a historical philosophic tension between reductionism and synthesis. And the faculties of medical schools then, and still today, are reductionist. And if you stand back, you can respect that, because if you don't spend an awful lot of time and energy learning how to do a particular operation or learning how to understand a particular chronic disease, you're probably not going to be able to make any progress in helping people. But here we're talking about training a set of physicians who can deal with the undifferentiated patient. Somebody that comes into the office and says, Doc, I've got this terrible pain under my shoulder blade. It's been there for 3 months, and it's really worse now. Where do you go with that? That is what family docs are trained exquisitely well to do, is to sort through a number of different things. Is it pulmonary? Is it cardiovascular? Is it neuromuscular? Et cetera, and not to throw every lab test in the world at it. Reach a working diagnosis, start doing the appropriate lab or examinations to work that up. 90% of the time they're right, and 10% of the time they say, well, that wasn't the right hypothesis, let's try something else. So you had a real culture conflict there with, quite frankly, many in the medical schools then, I would say substantial numbers now of faculty saying, we just don't need that type of doctor. I mean, if you want somebody to be at the front lines, just train a nurse. And, they'll take care of 85% of the stuff, and the rest of it, you can just send to the emergency room and we'll get involved with it. So real problems with culture, real problems in
Right.
different ways of looking at how a trained medical professional can serve the community and serve the patients. What made a difference in a number of medical schools was they were state supported. And it was a pretty easy sell in many, many states to go to the state legislatures who were concerned about the loss of the good old general practitioner in their community and say, that model of doctor is dying out, but this is a new model which is going to provide the same sort of services but with better training. And we need your support, state, because the medical schools don't want this department. They don't want to train physicians this way. And look at what's happening in Minnesota, and look at what's happening in California. And they've got great programs out there. The students love it. There are more students trying to get into family medicine residencies than there are slots. And the leverage probably in 70% of the medical schools in the first 10 years that went from no Department of Family Medicine to a Department of Family Medicine was mediated through the state legislature.
So would you say that it's fair to say that really what I would call activated patients, otherwise known as citizens, expressing their concerns to the legislature, challenging their legislature to change things so that their communities would have docs to take care of them, that was a really important piece of the growth of family medicine?
I don't know how strong an argument I would make that this was a citizens movement. The key players in getting the state legislators involved were the state chapters of the academy. They were, they knew their states, they knew the legislators. You have a relationship between the state academies and the state legislatures that you just can't duplicate on a national level.
Right.
Now, the type of patient testimony that you could get would be very, very supportive, but it wasn't like in Kansas you had 500 people going to Topeka and lobbying the state legislature.
Right.
You had the Kansas Academy of Family Physicians and their leaders, and probably a few very well tied in citizens that could make this argument.
Okay. So as you watched this change happen, could you comment on, I've heard stories about what I call the scope of practice wars, community by community, in many cases hospital by hospital, in addition to just getting inside the door, not only in the academic medical centers and the teaching hospitals, but out in the world of practice in hospitals across the country. There were significant fights where family docs, family physicians at the time were trying to get privileges to do the kind of things that they were trained and capable of doing, and there was great resistance. Could you comment about, give us an idea of how big a deal that was?
Yeah, there's a long thread there. One of the reasons, one of the emphases behind moving from general practice to family medicine was the experience of GPs coming back after World War II, where if you were a GP in uniform, you were paid less than the subspecialist in uniform. And then coming back into their communities and finding that you were starting to have people on the hospital medical staff saying, well, we're not sure you ought to have that privilege. We're not sure you ought to have another privilege. Now, early in the movement from general practice to family medicine, and there was still some of this in the academy when I got there in 73, there were still some delegates in the Congress of Delegates that felt pretty strongly that every family practice resident should be trained to do operative surgery, and that ought to be, any movement away from that in the essentials of the residency review committee, so that you had people coming out of residencies who couldn't do an appendectomy, couldn't do this, that, or the other thing, that was wrong. That sort of played out over a number of years, and fairly early in family medicine, it was acknowledged that a family doctor as a primary surgeon in most communities was not going to be the right answer, that there were going to be adequate surgeons and better trained and doing more procedures and more familiar with it. Special exceptions have to be made for family docs in frontier areas where there is no backup.
Right.
And they had different training, and they acknowledged you really need to do that. The biggest, and I think today probably still ongoing, battle is around obstetrical privileges, because this is something that is central to the family medicine philosophy of care of the family through all generations of life. The actual act of delivering a baby is not a supremely technical act. Most deliveries, thankfully, are normal and without complications. And that was where a number of family docs started to feel a little pressure. Now, in the hospitals, there's a continuum of hospitals that wanted to have family practice residencies. The friendliest hospitals are on the friendliest end of the continuum were community-based hospitals, where they really wanted another generation of physicians that could provide a source of referrals and patients for the hospital. And they saw this, GP base going away, and they saw the family docs coming into those communities, doing the broad spectrum of care, admitting patients to their hospital. And they said, we want more of your people, and the way to do that was to have a residency. As you get into so that's the sweet spot. As you get into larger, still non-teaching hospitals, where they have a larger and larger obstetrical staff, then, the privilege issue was just ongoing. And then once you get into academic health science center or academic centers or large private hospitals that are teaching hospitals, and they've got their own obstetrical residency program and a family practice residency program, those were, and I think probably still continue to be, the problem areas.
So one of the things that's interesting in this current era, I saw a study, I think it came out back this spring. There's a significant gap between the intentions of the residents, what they say they want to be able to do when they go out into practice. And it's not just OB, it's around other areas as well. And then within a year or two of having gone out into the world of practice, what they're actually able to do. And there seems to be either the family physicians are just giving up their dreams, or the systems are not allowing them and they're acquiescing. I'm wondering, given your experience, if you could comment on that.
Well, you're talking about things that may be happening now or in the last 10 years, and I've been away from day-to-day contact with family medicine for almost 20 years now. I left the academy in 2000. But I continue to be involved in a lot of issues related to medicine. I think there's probably a third factor there, and that is the generation of medical students, residents, and young family physicians today probably have a different view of how they would like to spend their time as physicians than the graduates in 1970. And, if you're around some of the quote-unquote old docs, there are complaints about, well, these young docs, they just want a salary. They, just want to practice 9 to 5. They don't want to take house call, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's, I think that's going to be probably an individual answer for each physician. But there's no question today that the practice of primary care medicine, where family practice is at the center, the nature of the patient population has not changed. You still need somebody at the sharp point of the spear who can deal with the undifferentiated patient in a quality, cost-effective way, and knows them in the context of who they are, who their family is, and knows them over time. You're not getting the person walking in with that pain under their shoulder blade, and you've never seen them before. If you've never seen them before, you probably got to do an EKG. If you've taken care of them for 20 years, that may not be where you start. But the organization of medical practice today uses primary care in a different way. There's been a very strong movement that I think is a positive movement towards patient-centered medical homes. Those are organized on a team base. You use different healthcare professionals differently than in a traditional practice. It may provide a greater latitude for the physician to have a substantial and enjoyable life that is not totally dedicated to medicine. There was a generation of people that went into medicine that said, basically, I'm going to practice 60 or 70 hours a week, and that's going to be very fulfilling. That may not have been really great on the family side. Now, about half of the residents are female. You continue to have, real differences in terms of family responsibilities between males and females, particularly when there are young children involved. And there needs to be a flexibility to accommodate the different personal needs and personal interests and still be able to practice quality medicine. So how much of this is residents graduating with a set of competencies and then going out into a practice and environment and finding that they're told that they cannot do this, versus they graduate with a set of competencies but they go into a practice environment and find that to tailor the practice to meet their balance of needs between professionalism and personal, there are things they do not do. I don't know.
Okay, good point. Good point. So I'd like to take you back now to the founders. That was the world that you were working with. What's your sense of them and their vision, and what was it about them that really helped them to succeed?
Well, energy and passion. If you're ever in the Academy headquarters building, they've got pictures of all of the presidents that go back to 1947.
Yes, I've seen that. It's impressive.
Really impressive array, and I've had a chance to meet or talk with or work with pretty much all of them back into the 50s. That was the advantage of getting involved in this in really very early stage of my career. So they had a passion for the discipline of family of general practice. They had a sense of what the contribution could be to a community of a dedicated generalist. who knew their patients, who knew them in the context of community, who could pretty much take care of them, all the way through, from birth to death. So I think that, and I've had this conversation with a couple of people because the question keeps getting asked the same way. What were they looking for? What was success? There were within those leaders of family medicine probably different views of what success would be. If you talk to Nicholas Pizzicato, who was the driving force for the formation of the American Board of Family Practice, Nick really wanted family practice, family medicine, to get the respect of the academic community as intellectually rigorous, and that's why you had to have board certification. And then he went one step, or the board went one step beyond that, and said everybody gets a time-limited certificate. All of these other people, you pass the test one time, and then who knows what you know. You're going to have to pass a test every 7 years. That's evolved, but that was kind of a stake in the ground. So that was Nick Pizzicato and what he was passionate about. Another leader early in the academy is Amos Johnson, and I've mentioned him earlier in this discussion. Amos was just a good country doctor from eastern North Carolina who had enormous political skills, and he almost single-handedly walked that bill through the Congress that got money into family practice residencies and to develop the residencies and provide financial support. But for Amos and the academy at that point, they wanted respect, they wanted privileges, and they wanted fair pay. So that's a somewhat different vision. And then you've got Gail Stevens, who, better than anybody else in the discipline, was able to articulate the essential importance of the relationship between the physician and the patient, and how important that relationship was not only to the patient's health, medical, but to their well-being, emotional. And so each of them had a tremendous impact on the discipline, but they probably had different endpoints that they were trying to get to.
Thank you very much, Bob.
All right, take care. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.